Hi there, I'm Jake. I'm a park ranger here in the Blind Eternities. Today I want to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, the reprint. When I first became a park ranger, the reprint was the lifeblood of Standard. Existing within their natural habitat of the core set, reprints numbered close to 1,000 every year, but have been dwindling over time, now practically being an endangered species numbering less than 100. We've seen reprints pushed to the side, their natural habitat being eliminated altogether, and despite the success of our Commander reprint proliferation program, new reprints not being suitable to the broader environment of Standard have limited their ability to impact those formats. Today I want to talk about our new program, where we hope to introduce reprints to the wild, to each and every person that needs them, to bring back a core set of Standard for years to come. Today, we're going to talk about Magic Foundations. So before we start talking about reprints broadly, I want to talk about reprints specifically. See, when I first started playing Magic, Standard was on a standard 2-year rotation, and every other year we saw a core set printed with many of the same cards from Magic's very first set. If you look at the print dates of core sets, I think it tells an interesting story. Because initially, when Alpha was printed, there was this realization that there weren't enough cards for the number of people that wanted them. So they printed Beta, and then they printed Revised. And it was all in such a short period of time. We got first, second, and third edition pretty much all in the same year, with pretty much all the same cards. And then we saw fourth, fifth, and we start to overflow a little bit. There's so many of these reprints of core cards. People are building decks that look the same. And so the reprints slowed down and our core sets started to go every other year. 6th edition, skip a year. 7th edition, skip a year. 8th edition. And with each of these core sets, they set the stage for what Standard would look like. Now, during this period of time, I had a friend, let's call him Peter, who liked playing blue decks. And there's a lot of jokes online about people who build blue decks and their personalities and their attitudes, and I think that hits differently for somebody who knows what Magic was like before Commander. Before you had 100 unique cards, and even if you wanted to have a significant overlap between decks, they didn't all feel quite the same. Depending on what your commander was and what other colors you might introduce, the decks were all a little varied. But in the past, that blue deck that Peter ran, I could almost give you the deck list right now. 4 counterspells, 4 mana leaks, 4 unsummon, 4 boomerang, maybe 4 force spikes if it was in Standard at the time. You get the picture. There were so many counterspells and bounce cards that you could jam into one deck. They were all being reprinted in the core sets, that from one Standard to the next, the deck looked almost identical. Maybe the top 10 or 15 cards would get rotated out, and you'd pull in the top 10 or 15 most interesting looking cards from the next set. But realistically, that blue deck was always the same blue deck. And I think that was both good and bad for Standard. It meant that if there were certain archetypes that were extremely strong in Standard, you could expect them to stick around pretty much forever. But it also meant that as an enfranchised player, your investment is protected. That really cool set of cards that you put together to build your first Standard deck would last you quite a while, as long as a lot of those cards are from those core sets. Recently, it feels like every year you have to completely retool your Standard deck because half of it vanished overnight. Foundations is going to give us the opportunity to have a core to our deck that we know is not going to rotate. It doesn't stop us from building Standard decks using exclusively cards from outside Foundations, but if at any given point you start to fall off that treadmill, maybe there's a set that doesn't interest you or mechanics that you don't find particularly engaging, you can always fall back on the cards printed in Foundation. So let's talk about the reprints in Foundations. The new cards are discussed in detail on a lot of other channels, and I think there's a lot of really cool things that that's going to do for Standard, but right now, we're going to talk retrospectively. Let's look at what's coming back. So the reprints and foundations, I believe, come in two broad categories: reprints for standard and reprints for everything else. And the reason I separate it like that is because I think the reprints for everything else go further than just reprints for Commander. And I know a lot of people's eyes are drawn to some of those legendary creatures that were printed in this Foundation set. And I think some of those creatures are actually going to have an impact on Standard. I'm excited to see what kind of weird Krenko decks pop up. But I think beyond that, we see reprints that are really healthy for Pioneer and Pauper that haven't been made in quite some time. We see some interesting rarity shifts on cards that give us access to some things that we didn't necessarily have access to before in those formats. I think Foundations, the reprints that they made here, set the stage for a lot of changes in the next couple years in those major formats across Magic the Gathering. But the reprints for Standard are what interest me most. Because Standard is something that I played a lot of. I was very heavily invested in Standard. For 6 or 7 years, I was going to every single Friday Night Magic. And I have the player rewards cards to prove it. I really like having that fresh environment. Every couple of years, seeing those shifts, the changes in the metagame, the ebbs and flows of combo to control to aggro to mid-range. Decks would shift on a dime with a new set dropping, new cards completely shaking up the metagame. And as cards rotated out, everyone breathed a sigh of relief that the boogeyman was no longer legal in Standard. And it's not necessarily power creep, but just the way the mechanics work together, there doesn't feel to be that glue that connects things. And that's what I think Foundations is going to be. A lot of the cards printed in Foundations are generically good. They might be specific to a creature type or specific to a certain play style, but I don't think any of them really lock you in to playing one particular archetype. The cards that are good in control are going to be good in control broadly, regardless of what mechanics come in new Standard sets. I hear a little bit of concern about Universes Beyond being brought into Standard. And I get the trepidation about the power level of some of these cards or the mechanics that might be brought in. But the reality is, this has been the case for every set from throughout all of Magic's history. There's new mechanics that get introduced that completely take over Standard. See Affinity or Madness. A couple of these mechanics that really turn the game on its head. And I think even if we see some of those in these Universes Beyond products, as much of a shakeup as it might be for the meta, we still have those Foundations mechanics to fall back on. A lot of these cards are powerful. And a lot of them, you'll notice, are targeted at removing certain aspects of the game. Right? There's a good amount of graveyard hate. There's a good amount of destroy all creatures. There's a good amount of go wide, go tall, trample over, unblockable, a variety of these different things that we can use to get around some of these things that might be coming down the line. I think Foundations is intelligently designed to deal with some of the more common problems within Magic the Gathering. And I think it's going to be really cool to see the decks that come out of that. Right now, I want to talk about the deck that I am most excited for, based on the reprints in Foundations. This alone is the deck that might drag me back into Standard after years of being away. Out of every deck that I own, this one is the most special to me. Now, I've said before that I really like my Rebel deck. I think it's a cool Commander deck. Before there were Rebels, there were Elves. This was one of my first decks that I ever built. And I spent a lot of time getting the cards together. I haven't updated it in a while. But this is my Legacy Elves deck. And does a lot of really cool, unique things that I think really only Elves can do. It has the ability to go super wide. It goes extremely fast. It plays like a combo deck, but has the ability to aggro somebody down. It ticks a lot of the boxes for decks that I enjoy. And seeing the reprints in Foundations got me excited because, like I said, I've been playing elves for a long time. So long, in fact, that after I put this deck together, I had to take apart a few other decks to assemble it. And see, one of those decks was my standard elf deck. I just pulled one of the drawers out of my card catalog. These cards just live here. These are other elf cards that didn't quite make the cut. But here's the funny thing about standard. See, a lot of the cards that are not good enough for modern or legacy can do just fine in standard. And when we see some of these reprints, well, I'm really excited to be able to use Llanowar Elves again, be able to use Imperious Perfect again, to be able to use Elvish Archdruid again. Some of these cards that are really strong and have been out of standard for quite some time. The thing is, it can be really tempting when you're building an elf deck for standard to lean on some of those standard elves that already exist. Right? You look at things like Leafcrown Visionary, and it seems like an auto-include in the deck. But I think if we pause and take a step back, we might be better off using some of the elves that are found strictly in Foundations. Lean on Lathril a little bit. Introduce a suite of black removal into your elf deck. You could rely on things like Genesis Wave being reprinted, and just focus on generating a lot of mana. Go extremely wide with several different lords. I think you might actually be able to run purely mana-generating elves and something like the, Banner of Kinship in the new set, to then attack with your entire team. There's a lot of different ways to build elves. I see interesting roots with green-black. I see interesting roots with green-white. And you have the Lord that cares about colors, green creatures +1/+1 and white creatures +1/+1. I think you have options for going green-blue and taking some of these other hybrid control cards and focus on controlling the board using the mana that you generate to really get ahead of your opponent. Scale up to something like Omniscience and really go nuts. Include some planeswalkers that you're really just trying to protect with a wall of creatures in front of them. The cool thing about reprints like this is whatever's coming down the line, whatever sets are going to be printed in the future, we're going to be able to use these cards as a foundation to build weird decks on top of it. We're going to see this evolution of standard decks that are 80% the same, but still very different from each other. And I'm really excited to see where that standard goes. Because recently, I haven't found a lot of love for standard. But this is going to bring me back. It's been nice talking to you.